Part 2, Blood and Betrayal. The moment Lena's blood fused with Drake's, the world seemed to fracture. The commander's massive body convulsed, his armored plates shifting unnaturally as his veins pulsed with golden light. The guards, loyal Vorath soldiers who had spent their lives obeying his every command, now hesitated, their weapons trembling in their grip as they witnessed something impossible. Drake Tor, the merciless conqueror who had led fleets into battle without flinching, was writhing on the floor like a wounded animal, his 4 eyes blazing with an alien radiance. Lena staggered back, her own hand still dripping blood, her mind racing with the horrifying realization that she had no idea what she had just unleashed. The ship's alarms wailed like a chorus of damned souls, the walls shuddering as secondary explosions rippled through the vessel, and in the chaos, Talia grabbed Lena's arm, her voice barely audible over the din. "What did you do to him?" she demanded, her dark eyes wide with terror. Lena could only shake her head, because the truth was, she didn't know. Drake's transformation was both grotesque and mesmerizing. His exoskeleton cracked and reformed, the jagged edges of his armor smoothing into sleek, obsidian-like plates that gleamed under the flickering emergency lights. His claws elongated, then retracted, as if his body couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the convulsions stopped. The commander went still, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. When his eyes opened again, they were no longer just amber, they were threaded with streaks of gold, pupils dilating and contracting like a predator's in the dark. He sat up with an eerie, unnatural grace, his movements too fluid, too precise, as if his muscles had been rewired. The guards took another step back, their weapons fully raised now, but Drake didn't even glance at them. His gaze locked onto Lena, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that wasn't hatred or disdain, it was hunger. "What are you?" he breathed, his voice no longer just a growl but layered with something else, something deeper, as if 2 voices spoke at once. Before Lena could answer, the ship lurched violently, throwing them all to the ground. A metallic screech tore through the air as the ceiling buckled, and a section of the corridor outside collapsed in a shower of sparks. The guards scrambled for stability, their comms crackling with panicked reports, reactor failure imminent. All hands, abandon ship. But Drake didn't react to the chaos. He was still staring at Lena, his nostrils flaring as if he could smell the change in her blood. Then, without warning, he moved. One moment he was kneeling, the next he was standing, his body a blur. The nearest guard didn't even have time to scream before Drake's claws tore through his armor like paper, blue blood spraying across the cell walls. The second guard fired, but Drake dodged the plasma bolt, not with a warrior's instinct, but with something far worse, precognition. He knew where the shot would land before it left the barrel. The guard's faceplate shattered under Drake's fist, and then there was silence. Lena's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She had just watched a monster remake itself into something worse. Drake turned back to the humans, his golden amber eyes flickering with something unreadable. "We're leaving," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Why would you help us?" Jace demanded, his voice shaking. Drake's lips peeled back in a smile that showed too many teeth. "Because her blood is in my veins now. And I need to know what that means." The ship groaned around them, a dying beast. Somewhere deep in its belly, the reactor was failing. They had minutes, maybe less. Lena swallowed hard. She had saved his life. Now she had to pray that wasn't a mistake. Part 1, The Prisoner's Choice. The dim, flickering lights of the holding cell cast eerie shadows across the rusted metal walls, the air thick with the acrid scent of antiseptic and fear. Lena Voss, her dark hair matted with sweat and her medic's uniform torn at the shoulder where the Zorith Empire's drones had seized her, sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her fingers absently tracing the faded scars on her forearm, reminders of the experiments they had done on her back at Blackstar Station. Across the cramped cell, her fellow prisoners, Dr. Rhea Patel, the brilliant but weary exobiologist, Jace Morrow, the quick-witted engineer with a knack for hacking alien tech, and Talia Nguyen, the quiet, wide-eyed teenager whose genius-level intellect had made her a target, huddled together, their whispers barely audible over the distant hum of the warship's engines. They had been captured during the raid on their remote research outpost, and now, stripped of their equipment and dignity, they were nothing more than specimens in the eyes of their captors. The Zorith Empire had no interest in diplomacy, only conquest, and the secrets hidden in human DNA. The door hissed open without warning, and Lena's breath caught in her throat as a massive Vorith warrior, his armored body slick with blue-tinged blood, staggered into the cell before collapsing at her feet. Commander Drake Tor, a legend even among his own kind, feared across 5 systems for his brutality in battle, now lay wounded, his 4 amber eyes burning with pain and defiance as he locked onto hers. "You, human medic," he rasped, his voice a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the floor. "Fix this." Lena's hands trembled as she assessed the damage. A plasma burn had torn through his secondary circulatory sac, the equivalent of a liver puncture in humans. She had studied Vorith anatomy in secret during her captivity, knowing that knowledge might one day mean survival. But without proper medical tools, she was helpless. The guards, hulking drones with faceless helmets, ignored her demands for supplies, their loyalty to their commander apparently outweighed by their disdain for the human prisoners. It was Talia who broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper as she leaned in. "Lena, your blood. You know what they did to you at Blackstar. It's not normal anymore." Lena's stomach twisted. Project Phoenix, the classified military experiment that had rewritten her cells, turning her blood into something more than human. The nanites were supposed to have degraded years ago, but their legacy remained, dormant in her veins. If she tried to use it now, there was no telling what it would do to an alien biology. But as Drake's breathing grew labored, his claws scraping weakly against the floor, she made her choice. With a sharp exhale, she dragged a shard of broken metal across her palm, hissing as crimson welled up. "This is going to hurt," she muttered, pressing her bleeding hand against his wound. The reaction was instantaneous. Drake's body arched off the ground, a guttural roar tearing from his throat as their blood mingled, his veins lighting up with an eerie golden glow. The guards recoiled, their weapons raised in alarm, but it was too late. The ship's AI blared to life, its voice cold and mechanical. "Containment breach in Sector 7. All personnel, evacuate immediately." The walls shuddered as distant explosions rocked the vessel, and in that moment, as Drake's eyes snapped open, now flecked with unnatural gold, Lena realized 2 things: she had just saved the life of her greatest enemy, and in doing so, she might have changed the fate of the entire galaxy. Part 3, The Escape Protocol. The warship groaned like a dying beast, its metal bones twisting under the strain of cascading system failures. Somewhere deep in its core, the reactor was losing containment, and the air stank of scorched circuits and ionized plasma. Lena pressed her back against the shuddering corridor wall, her pulse hammering in her throat as she watched Drake, no, not Drake anymore, something else, move ahead of them with terrifying precision. His body was a shadow in the flickering emergency lights, his movements too fast, too fluid, as if the laws of physics no longer applied to him. The golden veins beneath his armor pulsed faintly, a visible reminder of what she had done. What her blood had done. Jace cursed under his breath as he struggled to keep up, his engineer's hands fumbling with a stolen data pad. "The escape pods are 2 levels down," he hissed, "but half the ship's corridors are sealed off. We'll never make it before." A deafening explosion cut him off, the floor lurching violently beneath them. Lena grabbed Talia before the girl could fall, her fingers digging into the teenager's shoulder. Dr. Rhea Patel, ever the pragmatist, didn't flinch. "Drake," she said sharply, "if you can sense systems like you did that guard's attack, find us a path. Now." Drake didn't turn. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something none of them could hear. Then, without a word, he ripped open a maintenance panel beside them, exposing a maze of wiring and conduits. "Here," he growled. "Service tunnels. They run parallel to the main corridors. Less guarded." Lena didn't hesitate. She shoved Talia forward. Go. Move. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare, narrow, pitch black, and stinking of burnt insulation. They crawled on hands and knees, the distant screams of Vorith crew members echoing through the vents like ghosts. Every few seconds, another explosion would rock the ship, sending tremors through the metal around them. Lena's palms were slick with sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear Jace muttering behind her, counting down the seconds until the reactor blew. Then, without warning, Drake froze. Lena nearly collided with him. What? His hand clamped over her mouth before she could finish. His eyes, those unnerving, gold-streaked eyes, narrowed. They're waiting for us, he breathed, so quietly she almost didn't catch it. Who is? Rhea whispered. Drake didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head toward a vent grate ahead, his nostrils flaring. Lena followed his gaze, and her blood turned to ice. On the other side of the grate, silhouetted against the crimson emergency lights, stood 3 figures. Not Vorith. Not any species she recognized. Tall, skeletal, their limbs too long, their heads featureless except for a single, vertical slit where a mouth should have been. They moved in eerie unison, their clawed hands trailing along the walls as if tasting the metal. Talia made a small, terrified noise. What are those? Drake's grip tightened on the hilt of a stolen plasma blade. Hunters, he said. The Zoritha's real weapons. They don't just kill. They harvest. Lena's stomach twisted. Harvest. Like her. Like her blood. One of the creatures suddenly went still. Then, impossibly, it turned its head toward the vent. Drake didn't wait. He moved. The grate exploded outward as he lunged, his body a blur of obsidian armor and golden light. The first hunter died before it could react, its skull splitting under his claws. The second shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and lashed out, its talons raking across Drake's chest. Blue blood sprayed, but the wound sealed almost instantly, the flesh knitting itself back together before their eyes. The third hunter didn't attack. It looked at Lena. And then it spoke. Subject 9 Alpha, it hissed, its voice like nails on glass. You were not to leave. Lena's breath caught. 9 Alpha. Her designation from Blackstar. The creature lunged. Drake intercepted it midair, his fangs bared in a snarl. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the hunter's claws screeching against his armor. Lena didn't think, she grabbed a fallen plasma rifle and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough. The hunter recoiled, its featureless face somehow conveying rage. Run! Drake roared. They ran. The escape pod bay was in chaos, Vorith soldiers scrambling over each other in their desperation to evacuate. None of them paid attention to the humans, not with death breathing down their necks. Jace hacked the nearest pod's controls with shaking hands, the console beeping frantically. 30 seconds until launch, he shouted. Rhea shoved Talia inside. Go, go. A shadow fell over them. The hunters were back. All 3. And they weren't alone. Drake met Lena's eyes across the bay. For a heartbeat, she saw something in his gaze, not the cold calculation of a warlord, but something fiercer. Something human. Then he turned and charged. The fight was brutal. Drake moved like a storm, his body bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, his claws tearing through the hunter's unnatural flesh. But they were fast. Too fast. One of them got past him, its talons slicing toward Lena. A plasma bolt took it in the chest. Lena whirled. Talia stood in the pod's doorway, her hand steady on a smoking pistol. I told you I've been practicing, she said weakly. The pod's engines whined to life. They were out of time. Drake! Lena screamed. He ripped the last hunter's spine out through its chest and turned, just as the bay doors began to seal. He wouldn't make it. Then he leaped. The pod shuddered as he crashed onto its hull, his claws digging into the metal. The engines fired, and suddenly they were hurtling into the void, the warship exploding behind them in a silent, blinding flare. Inside the pod, gasping for breath, Lena stared at Drake as he hauled himself inside. His wounds were already healing. His eyes burned brighter than ever. And when he looked at her, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Part 4, The Hidden Evolution. The escape pod tumbled through the void, its stabilizers struggling to correct its trajectory as the shockwave from the warship's destruction buffeted it like a leaf in a hurricane. Inside, the humans clung to their harnesses, their faces pale under the dim emergency lighting. Lena's fingers dug into the armrests, her knuckles white, her mind still replaying those final moments, the hunters' hollow faces, their too long limbs, the way they had known her. 9 Alpha. The designation they'd given her at Blackstar Station. The name she tried to forget. Drake crouched in the center of the pod, his massive frame making the cramped space feel even smaller. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his golden-veined hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, Lena realized, but from something else. Something hungry. His wounds had closed unnaturally fast, the flesh knitting itself back together before their eyes, but the process seemed to have taken something from him. His eyes, now more gold than amber, burned with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Jace was the first to break the silence. "Okay, let's recap," he said, his voice strained. "We're adrift in a stolen escape pod with limited oxygen, no food, and a mutating alien warlord who may or may not decide to kill us at any second. Oh, and we're being hunted by whatever those things were back there. Did I miss anything?" Talia, curled into herself in the corner, let out a shaky laugh. "You forgot the part where Lena's blood is basically alien superfuel." Lena shot her a glare, but the damage was done. Drake's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring as if he could smell the truth in the air. "Explain," he demanded, his voice layered with that eerie double timbre. Rhea sighed, rubbing her temples. "Project Phoenix," she said, her tone clinical despite the exhaustion lining her face. "Blackstar Station's pet project. Military-grade nanites designed to enhance cellular regeneration in combat medics. Lena was one of the test subjects." Lena's jaw tightened. She didn't like talking about Blackstar. Didn't like remembering. The endless tests, the needles, the way her body had burned as the nanites rewrote her DNA. "The program was scrapped," she muttered. "Officially, at least. The nanites were supposed to degrade after a few months. But I guess some of them stuck around." Drake's gaze never left her. "And now they are in me." It wasn't a question. The pod shuddered again, its systems beeping a weak warning. Jace scrambled to the controls, his engineer's instincts kicking in. "We've got maybe 6 hours of oxygen left," he said, his fingers flying over the console. "But if I can reroute power from the backup cells, I might be able to get a distress signal out. Assuming there's anyone left out there to hear it." Lena didn't miss the way his eyes flicked to Drake. The Vorith Empire had been hunting humans for years, stripping them apart in labs, dissecting their genetics for weaknesses. Who would answer a call from their most feared enemy's own ship? Drake stood abruptly, his head nearly brushing the ceiling. "We will not need a signal," he said, his voice certain. Rhea frowned. "And why's that?" He turned toward the viewport, where the endless black of space stretched before them. "Because I can feel them." Lena's breath caught. "Feel what?" His claws flexed. "The others like me. The Vorith battleship Ascendant." High Commander Vexus Tor, Drake's former superior and the architect of 100 campaigns of conquest, stood in the war room of the Ascendant, her 4 eyes scanning the holographic reports with growing fury. The destruction of the research vessel had been a setback, but it was the other reports that concerned her. The ones her scientists dared not speak aloud. Confirm it, she snarled at the trembling bioengineer before her. The engineer's tentacles quivered as he manipulated the data stream. The readings are undeniable, High Commander. Commander Drake's vitals spiked beyond Vorath physiological limits before the ship's destruction. His cellular structure is evolving. Vexus's claws dug into the console. And the human? The female medic's blood contains traces of an unknown catalyst. When combined with Vorath DNA, it appears to trigger a cascading enhancement of latent genetic potential. A murmur rippled through the assembled officers. Vexus silenced it with a look. You're telling me that human blood is rewriting one of our finest warriors? The engineer hesitated. Not rewriting. Awakening. Vexus turned back to the star map, her mind racing. If this was true, if Drake's transformation was spreading. Dispatch the Revenant fleet, she ordered. I want that human alive. And as for Commander Drake. Her mandibles clicked in grim finality. Terminate on sight. The escape pod. Lena couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hunters. Heard their voices. 9 Alpha. She rubbed her arms, the scars there itching beneath her sleeves. Across the pod, Drake sat motionless, his eyes closed, his breathing slow. But she knew he wasn't sleeping. Couldn't sleep. Not with whatever was happening to him. She crept closer, her voice a whisper. What did you mean earlier? About feeling others like you? His eyes opened, the gold in them pulsing faintly. The Vorath are not one species, he said. We are many. Bred for war. But long ago, before the Empire, we were something else. Something more. His claws flexed. Your blood, it is waking that up in me. Lena swallowed. And the others? Drake's gaze turned distant. They are coming. Outside the viewport, the stars seemed to shudder. Then the first ship dropped out of warp.